The Sega Genesis was such a special time when I was a kid. Of course, not every game was a winner, but that hardware had so many classics that defined my childhood and gave me so many firsts. My first import game, my first CD system, my first real taste of having an arcade experience in my home. Year after year, title after title, the Genesis delivered again and again on the promise of being an entertainment system like no other. From the moment I first saw that box sitting on the shelf at KB Toys, proclaiming arcade graphics and sound, new dimensions in gameplay, and 16-bit power, I was absolutely enthralled with Sega's promise to change my gaming world. Even when the console had begun to age substantially and its games began to lack the same polish, I stayed glued to my Genesis and supported it well past its prime. It had taken a backseat to machines like the Saturn, PlayStation, and Nintendo 64, but I still played it as the final batch of titles hit in 1997. Games like NFL 98 and The Lost World were bittersweet reminders of all the great gaming the Genesis had given me, but it was time to put the platform to sleep permanently. And for months I thought the Genesis was truly dead. Games had stopped. Saturn was dead in North America. Sega was talking about the Dreamcast coming soon. The 16-bit era seemed a lifetime away in 1998, and the last thing I expected to see was another officially released title for the Genesis. But that's exactly what we got in October of 1998, nearly a year after Electronic Arts' NBA Live 98, the previous last officially released Genesis title. Frogger was that game, an unlikely port of an arcade release originally dropped in 1981. Did it deserve the honor of the last Genesis game with Sega's seal of quality? Let's find out. Frogger for the Genesis was developed by Morningstar Multimedia under license from Hasbro Interactive and published by Majesco Sales. You may remember that Majesco Sales was responsible for the budget-minded Genesis 3 model, a reissue of the hardware in 1998 where they also licensed a number of big-name properties alongside it. Frogger was in that batch of games that was meant to revitalize the Genesis market as a much cheaper budget option to the big-name consoles from Sony and Nintendo. But what we got here was quite unexpected. Instead of some fancy remake with radically new sound and visuals, it was instead a port of the original arcade game that was released 17 years prior. The goal of this one is to get your frog across the road and a swamp safely to his home. The road is full of cars looking to squash you, while the swamp has lethal water that must be avoided by jumping on logs and turtles. Be careful, there are various things in the swamp that also want to eat you. There is also a chance for extra score by picking up another frog and carrying them home with you. You can't mess around though, there is a timer that pushes the game along, making the later stages quite a challenge. These later stages have more enemies, faster moving obstacles, and more of them. Back in 1981, it was an instant classic and one of the most playable and appealing titles available in the arcade. This port is both a blessing and a curse when it comes to visuals. For those wanting an arcade Frogger on the Genesis, this was pretty damn close. The sprites and playfield mimicked the original quite closely, so in that regard, it was a resounding success. But this was 1998, and you'd think it would have upgraded the visuals to something that took a little more advantage of the hardware. More color, more detailed sprites and play areas, more animation. The funny thing was, there was also a Super Nintendo version released that year, and it was a total remake that was a completely different product in terms of graphics. It updated the graphics across the board, giving everything more detail and animation. I guess where you stand on this pretty much depends on your expectations. Did you want a solid port of the arcade, or did you want something that looked better? The answer will greatly affect your opinion of it. The music and sound effects are surprisingly close to the arcade original. There wasn't much in Frogger in this regard, but it's nice that it's really faithful. Here's a quick example of how it sounds. The story behind Frogger on the Genesis is an interesting one. The programmer was a guy named Scott Marshall, who used videos of himself playing the arcade ROM via emulation to study and copy the visuals and game logic. He meticulously timed his gameplay so that everything was as close as possible. He even used some of the data from the actual arcade ROM to recreate the music and sound effects. He then tested everything on a Genesis emulator to see how close it was to the original. And as interesting as all that is, I still can't help but to feel this should have been more. More to the visuals, more to the gameplay, more to the stages, more of something to make it stand out in 1998. The nice thing is that this game was dirt cheap at its release. At just $19.99, it was a great title for young Genesis owners, even if it didn't grab the attention of those wanting something new. Despite my initial disappointment that it wasn't an upgraded edition of the arcade, I have come to appreciate this version much more over the years. While some new stage types would have been nice, this is an excellent port of the arcade. It feels right, it looks and sounds right, and it's easy to pick up and play for 10 or 15 minutes on a whim. It was the bittersweet end of an unforgettable era of top-notch gaming experiences for those of us there from the beginning. I suppose at the time I wanted something else, but I shouldn't blame Frogger for not being Streets of Rage 4. It's actually kind of fitting that such a classic arcade game would end a Genesis market that preached such titles from the very beginning. You may be wondering, why would I review such a simple game? I really wanted to hammer home not just that this was indeed a final release without much fanfare, but also how Sega had let the Genesis fade away with so little effort. It had been their most successful platform by a mile, and yet they really did next to nothing for it at the end of its life. In its final 2 years of support, Sega published precious few releases, and outside of The Lost World and Vector Man 2, there wasn't much to write home about. In that same stretch of time, Nintendo published Super Mario RPG, Tetris Attack, Kirby Superstar, Street Fighter Alpha 2, Donkey Kong Country 3, Cold Shadow, and Kirby's Dream Land 3 to celebrate the Super Nintendo's final round of gaming. And before you say there was no life left in the Genesis that late, Sega's own NFL 98 moved over 1 million copies in 1997. The truly sad part is that the Genesis lifespan lasted right up until about the time the Saturn spat out its last round of titles in North America. 1998 was honestly a nightmare for US Sega fans all the way around. The Dreamcast was still over a year away, the Genesis and Saturn were dead, and all you kept hearing about in the media was how Sony was absolutely killing everyone with its juggernaut PlayStation brand. To see 2 Sega consoles come to an end so unceremoniously at a time of great uncertainty shook my fandom to the core. I understood that Sega of Japan was still supporting Saturn and preparing for Dreamcast, but there was no excuse for Sega of America not doing some more Genesis releases to keep things interesting. A Kid Chameleon 2, a Comic Zone 2, hell, anything really. I had been a Sega fan at this point for close to 20 years, and had never seen the company struggle for sales and recognition so fruitlessly, only to seemingly give up and leave its customers with nothing to play. They made it so easy for once proud Sega fans to move on to Sony and Nintendo. For the first time in the company's history, they seemed in full tilt panic mode, with half of management wanting to go left and the other half wanting to go right. Internally, there was a civil war happening I wouldn't know about until some years later. You really didn't know where things were going to end up or whether Sega was going to be okay in the end. In addition to this being the end of an era, it very well may have been the beginning of the end of the company I loved. I had no idea how true that would be until a few years later. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.